So, dear colleagues, distinguished guests, ladies, gentlemen, first of all, I would like to sincerely thank everyone who has joined this lecture today and who has shown interest in the topic we are going to discuss. The attention this topic has attracted maritime safety, language, and decision-making under wartime conditions, and shows just how relevant and how urgent this discussion has become. I'm especially grateful to the German-Ukrainian Academic Society for organizing this lecture and for continuous supporting academic dialogues on issues that are not only theoretically important, but also critically relevant in today's geopolitical and security context. And I would also like to express my sincere thanks to Dr. Natalia Butic, a member of the board of the German-Ukrainian Academic Society, for the welcoming remark and for her continued commitment to fostering academic and academical cooperation. I also like to express my sincere gratitude to Ms. Natalia Chernopashenko, advisor to Ambassador of Ukraine to the Federal Republic of Germany, for her support and for facilitating academic events of this level. My special thanks go to Dr. Alisa Lazarenko for her invitation and for opportunity to take part in this scientific event within framework of the lecture series Science Firsthand. And I would like to thank Dr. Antonina Bulina for moderating today's lecture. It is a privilege to contribute to a platform that brings research, professional experience, and contemporary challenges into direct dialogue. So, topic of today's lecture is particularly timely. Since 2022, civilian maritime navigation, especially in regions such as Black Sea, has continued under condition of sustained security pressure, and international law and maritime institutions formally remain in force. Yet, is a practical condition of navigation, communication, and decision-making have changed profoundly. And today I would like to invite you to look at maritime safety in wartime, not only as a legal or technical problem, but as a system in which language, institutional authority, human cognition, and education are deeply interconnected. We often assume that maritime safety is produced by routes, by technologies, by regulations, by charts, corridors, and digital system designed to reduce uncertainty at sea. This standard model relies on stable operational conditions. It assumes that once routes are defined and rules are in place, and navigation becomes predictable and safe. Under condition of heightened security risks, this assumption no longer holds. Uncertainty increases, decisions become time critical, and responsibility shifts decisively to the operator. In such environment, safety is no longer produced primarily through infrastructure or regulation. It is increasingly produced through language, through warnings, advisors, and institutional communications that require continuous professional interpretation. Since 2022, civilian navigation in the Black Sea has not ceased. Commercial vessels continue to operate. Port function irregularly, and international shipping corridors remain in use. What has changed is not the existence of navigation, but the regime under which it operates. Navigation in the Black Sea now governed by continuous flow of English language communication, navigation warnings, security advisors, and institution notes issued through international maritime system. These messages do not merely describe conditions at sea, they function as operational instruments. They require professional interpretation, and their interpretation has direct navigational consequence. My certain argument today is that in a high-risk security environment, language does not merely transmit decision, it produces them. And safety is no longer stable condition guaranteed by law or technology. It becomes a professional judgment. It forms under pressure through reading, through interpreting, and acting upon institution language. To examine how language operates as a safety instrument under security pressure, I proceed in three steps. Framework, how international law and the maritime institution structure navigation under sustained security risk, interpretation, how safety-related communication are processed in practice, and decision-making, how professional judgment are formed under pressure, and why this matter for safety and education. To understand why language and communication have become so central for maritime safety, we first need to understand why the Black Sea matters today, not only regionally, but globally. And since February 2022, the Black Sea has shifted from a regional maritime space to an area of global concern. It is critical corridor Europe, the Mediterranean, and global trade routes, with direct implications for international shipping, energy, transport, and global food security. And when access to Ukrainian ports was restricted and navigational risk increases, the effect extends far beyond the region, affecting global supply chains, insurance market, and maritime governance. International maritime institutions formally acknowledge this shift by classifying the Black Sea and the Azov Sea as a high-risk maritime areas. And since 2022, safety communication in the region has become continuous rather than episodic, reflecting a permanently altered security environment. Crucially, high-risk designation does not suspend navigation, and it transforms how navigation is governed through intensified advisors, warnings, and ongoing professional risk assessment. So maritime security in the Black Sea now relies primarily on communication rather than infrastructure. Civilian maritime navigation has not stopped. What has changed is the condition under which it takes place. And military risk is no longer exceptional, it is structurally embedded. And before 2022, risk assessment functioned mainly as preliminary stage of voyage planning. Today, it has become a continuous operational process. The left graphs shows the reclassification of the Black Sea into a high-risk maritime area. The right graph shows that navigation now continues not under stable civilian conditions, but through constant institutional communication. If maritime security has shifted from a stable civilian framework to a dynamic high-risk regime, the next question is unavoidable. How do law and institutions respond when legal norms remain intact, but operational reality is fundamentally altered? Periods of heightened insecurity risk do not nullify international maritime law. The foundation principles of maritime governance, freedom of navigation, the safety of life at sea, and the protection of civilian shipping, so remain formally in force even under condition of sustained security pressure. Civilian vessels continue to operate under international law. Ports function intermittently, and navigation corridors are maintained. What changes is not the law itself, but the relationship between legal norms and legal norms and operational reality. Navigation remains lawful but increasingly unsafe. So the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea provides a stable legal framework. And this framework designed for predictability and peacetime cooperation. It preserves freedom of navigation, even under elevated security risk. However, it was not designed to manage sustained military pressure, contested maritime space or continuous threat environments. As a result, a structural tension appears, legal stability is preserved, and operational certainty is not. United Nations Convention of the Law at Sea does not contain mechanism for managing real-time navigation decision-making under pressure security stress. This gap does not suspend navigation. Instead, it creates space for soft governance, advisors, warnings, some recommendations that do not alert legal rights, but profoundly affect navigational behavior. And this distinction, legal stability versus operational uncertainty, forms a key analytical foundation of our lecture. So organizations such as in high-risk security environment, international maritime institutions play a mediating rather than directive role. And organizations such as International Maritime Organization do not issue binding navigation orders to a civilian vessel. Instead, they translate geopolitical development and security assessment into safe related communications. To support professional judgment, institutional authority under sustained security pressure is therefore exercised not through command but through communication. Law and institutions do not remove uncertainty from navigation, they structure it. The effectiveness of maritime governance under pressure thus depends not on legal compliances or institutional capacity, but on how safety-related information is communicated, interpreted, and acted upon in real time. The SOLAS Convention constitutes two cornerstone of international maritime safety regulations, and formally it is a technical instrument. Yet implicitly, SOLAS established communication as a safety critical function by requiring the dissemination of safety information, navigation warnings, and alert to vessels at sea. Importantly, that SOLAS does not regulate how such information is to be interpreted under condition of uncertainty, under condition of time pressure or elevated security risk. This omission reflects an underlying assumption of stable operation condition. So in high-risk security environment, this assumption no longer holds. So the absence of interpretive guidance create a structural gap between the provision of information and operational use, a gap that becomes safety critical under condition of wartime navigation. The International Safety Management Code moves further by explicit introducing the human element into the safe framework. It is recognized that safety depends on human decision-making. Decisions are taken under pressure, and responsibility is operationally transferred to the shipboard level. However, while responsibility is clear assigned, the communication conditions under which this responsibility is exercised remain under theories. So the ISM code does not address how linguistic formulation shape interpretation, action under the stress. So responsibility is therefore formalized, but linguistically unsupported. Since 2022, International Maritime Organization member state and committees have issued a volume of MSC circulars and security-related advisors concerning navigation in the Black Sea. And these texts are significant, not because they introduce new legal rules, but because of how they operate. They are not binding instrument. They do not suspend navigation or close sea areas. Operates through recommendation, advisors, and cautionary language. Linguistically, they rely on modal formulations such as may, should, and is advised. No action is command. Instead, the field of possible decision is structured. And this logic is very familiar for mariners. Let me start with a single sentence. Vessels are advised to exercise extreme caution. This is not order. It does not suspend navigation. It does not tell the ship what exactly to do. And yet on the bridge, in the high-risk area, under time pressure, this sentence cannot be ignored. A decision has to be made. This logic is not unique to institutional text, and every mariners recognize it from routine bridge communication. A common VHF phrase such as "I will cross ahead" is not incorrect language, but under time pressure, ambiguity itself becomes risk. So to avoid ambiguity, bridge communication must take intention, maneuver, and different confirmation explicit. The same mechanism operates at the institutional level. When a circular state vessels are advised to exercise extreme caution, so no maneuver is prescribed, but responsibility immediately shifts to the navigator. The advisory does not remove responsibility. It relocated from rules to professional judgment exercise through language. This is what I call linguistic governance in practice. Language does not simply describe risk. It structures decision making under pressure. A similar logic operates with the International Hydrographic Organization through instruments such as Navigation Area Warning System, Navigation Telex, and the Worldwide Navigation Warning Service. The International Hydrographic Organization established standardized formats, protocols, and distribution responsibility for navigation warning. These instruments are highly precise, but only with regard to form. They regulate how warnings are issued. They do not regulate how warnings are interpreted. Responsibility for interpretation is formally placed on the user, and under peacetime conditions, this allocation is functional. Under wartime condition, it's wartime navigation and elevated security pressure, it becomes a zone of heightened risk, as a linguistic and cognitive load is transferred to the navigation precisely when decision-making capacity is under maximum stress. Take together this normative framework reveal a consistent pattern. So international maritime law and institutions preserve legal continuity. Deliberately avoid direct command and increasingly rely on language-based instruments to manage risk. In high-risk security environments, maritime safety is therefore governed not primarily through orders or prohibitions, but through communication practice and shift interpretive responsibility to the operational level. At this point, it becomes useful to recall the argument developed by Professor Didi Bigo, whose work on security and risk. He emphasized that contemporary security operates less through reaction to threats, and more through preventive governance exercise via knowledge, authorities, categorization, and communication. And in his lecture, GPS security as a global preventive government, Professor Didier Bigot argues that security functions through indirect mechanisms that structure how future action is anticipated, assessed, and how normalized. And this perspective is directly applicable to maritime navigation under security stress. So navigation wardens and security advisors do not command action. They shape the condition within which professional judgment is exercised. International maritime law remains in force. Institutions continue to function. Navigation does not stop. And yet, safety in high risk security environments is no longer produced primarily through rules or command. It produced through communication, through warning that advise rather than order, through language that signal risk without prescribing action. So, language therefore becomes the interface between institutional authority and human decision making. To understand maritime safety and safety under sustained security pressure, we must now examine how language operates as a tool of safety in practice. And this brings us to the next part of the lecture, language as a tool of safety in wartime. If law and institutions provide the framework on maritime safety under pressure, language determines how this framework operates in practice. This is what safety looks like now. We often think that technology makes navigation objective. We trust charts, we trust sensors, radar, and digital system. But what actually reaches the breach is not decision, it's language. Digital navigation systems do not transmit decision. They transmit language, warnings, advisors, institutional language that must be interpreted in real time. On the screen, you can see an example of the communicative environment that governs wartime navigation, a real Novara warning issued for the Black Sea. And since 2022, civilian navigation in the region has been shaped by continuous flow of English language messages, Navtex telex and the Navarra warning, security advisors, institution communication, as issued by maritime administration and registries. And these texts do not simply describe condition at sea. They function as operating guidance encoded in language without issuing direct commands. From the perspective of the general analysis, institution texts are not neutral carriers of information. As demonstrated by Professor John Swellis, a British linguist known for his work on professional and institutional genres, function as conventionalized form of social and conventionalized form in professional action. And from this perspective, navigation warnings such as nav text and Vara messages operate not as descriptive text, but an action-oriented genres such that structure decision-making under specific operational condition. This table shows how navigational warning produce action without giving instruction. Linguistically, they use recommendation, probabilities, and neutral formulation. Operationally, they require the navigation to assess risk and decide what action to take. Nothing is commanded, yet responsibility is fully transferred to the navigator, and safety is therefore produced through interpretation, not instruction. Despite extensive research on maritime law, human factors, security risk, the linguistic mechanisms through which safety is operationalized in wartime navigation remain under-researched. Let me draw your attention to this graph. On the horizontal axis, You can see linguistic indirectness, advisor wordings, modal verbs, passive construction, probabilities, language. On the vertical axis, cognitive loads under stress. The key point here is not the exact values, but the relationship. So as linguistic indirectness increase, cognitive load does not grow gradually, it accelerates. And this shaded area represents a high-risk zone where ambiguity and stress interact. So what is a manageable under peacetime condition? It is because dangerous under wartime pressure. The grammatical form remain unchanged, but the operational load carried by the same linguistic form increases. And under wartime condition, linguistic ambiguity amplifies cognitive risk. So responsibility shift from system and procedures to human interpretation. At this point, the navigator is no longer just following instruction. This relationship becomes particularly visible in Black Sea since 2022. Navigation officers operate in environments characterized by drifting object, debris, report of drifting mines, elevated maritime security levels such as Marcel level 3, and routine zones governed primarily through advisors. And under this condition, safety is no longer produced through the rule alone. It is produced through how risk is linguistically formulated in warning and advisors. The critical task of navigation officer is not the absence of information. It is determining whether a message functions as a recommendation, an implicit restriction, as a probabilistic risk signal. Language is the context because a safety bottleneck. And under a wartime condition, how uncertainty is structured directly shapes navigation decision. This is why communication itself can become a source of risk in wartime navigation. And this has bring us to a core analytical move of my research, how institutional authority is exercised linguistically and how representability is redistributed through language under pressure. So the diagram summarizes the core analytical move of my research. At the outer level, norms, compliances, and jurisdiction. So maritime law examine legal norms, human factors, research concerning fatigue, workload, and situation awareness. Security studies focus on threat, risk, and geopolitical context. And across this approach, language is usually treated as a neutral medium, as a channel through which information is transmitted. The middle layer highlights what remains systematically under-analyzed, the linguistic feature through which institutional authority actually operate in practice. And this includes modality, expressions such as may, should, or advised, indirectness that avoid explicit command, passive constructions that obscure agency, and probabilistic language that signal uncertainty without instruction. Insight from critical discourse analysis help explain how institutional authority is exercised through language. And in this work, Norman Fairclough, a British scholar known from his research on language, and power in institutional setting, responsibility is shown to be redistributed through grammatical choice rather than explicit command. So modal verbs and passive constructions allow institution to signal risk while linguistically transferring the burden of interpretation and in action to individual professionals. At the center of the diagram in my research contribution, I show how a stable linguistic form, legal non-binding advisory language, acquires a decision triggering function under condition of security pressure. So the grammatic remains the same, but its operational meaning shift. So this is how risk is operationalized through language and how decision making is produced without command. At the stage, the focus shift from language itself to the human factor, and decades of maritime safety research shows that the human factor remains the most critical and the most vulnerable element of maritime safety. In wartime, this vulnerability is intensified. Stress is no longer episodic, it's cumulative. Navigation officers operate under continuous uncertainty, elevated responsibility, and sustained cognitive pressure. And they must process a continuous flow safety warning while maintaining situation awareness and legal compliances. And human cognitive capacity, however, does not expand in response to increased information demand. Research on safety critical system demonstrates that under stress and overload, performance degradation manifests not only as slow reaction, but more importantly, as altered interpretation of information. As shown by James Reason, error under stress is predictable outcome of systematic cognitive cognition rather than individual failure. And applied to wartime navigation, misinterpretation of safety-related message is therefore not exceptional. It is predictable response to cognitive load, time pressure, and information complexity. So my analysis shows that in the incident and near miss in high-risk maritime areas are rarely caused by lack of information. They are far more often associated with information overload and misinterpretation of linguistically encoded obligation, probability, and responsibility. And under pressure, professionals simplify interpretation. They rely on familiar patterns, and they overlook linguistic qualifiers such as the modal verbs and such a probabilistic markers. At this point, communication itself becomes a source of risk. What change is not the technology, but the cognitive environment. In wartime navigation, error is rarely technical. It is interpretative. While contemporary maritime governance recognizes fatigue, information overload as a safety risk, information is still largely treated as a neutral input. Insufficient attention is paid to how linguistic formulation shapes interpretation under pressure. In high-risk security environments, safety is therefore limited not by technology or regulation, but by human cognitive constraint. So responsibility is exercised at the point of interpretation, not the point of message insurance. At this stage, a critical distinction becomes unavoidable. Wartime maritime navigation in the Black Sea is governed not by single language of risk, but by the simultaneous operation of multiply linguistical register. So they circulate through the same institutional channels, operate the same language, English, and refer to the same maritime space. Yet they follow fundamental different communication logics. And this slide summarizes what I call three risk languages operating in one sea. So institutional register is used by organizations such as the IMO and IHO, operates according to the different logic. Its function is to support safety without issuing direct commands. So ambiguity here is a caution rather than strategic. Institutions preserve legal continuity and avoid explicit application, relying instead on advisors' formulation. Authority is exercised indirectly through language. So the critical issue is not any single register taken in isolation. Operational risk emerges when these registers interact. Diplomatic ambiguity fits into institutional advisors. Institutional advisors are amplified through commercial risk notice. All of these converge at the point of navigation interpretation under stress. And wartime conditions force this register to coexist with the same maritime space and increasingly within the same information channels. Navigation officers are exposed to messages that refer to the same area, but encode fundamentally different expectation of action. So this coexisting generates a structured communication tension. When diplomatic ambiguity is misread as operational flexibility, navigation risk increases. When operational warnings are interpreted through a diplomatic lens, decision making may be delayed on compromise. So many analysis shows that a significant share of interpretive difficulty in wartime navigation arises not from insufficient information, but from register confusion. Under these conditions, the critical professional skill is not merely language proficiency. It is ability to identify which linguistic register is in operation and to respond accordingly. And this has direct implication of maritime safety, professional responsibility, and education. So operational risk in wartime navigation emerges not from what is said, but from how different risk language interact under pressure. In wartime, maritime safety depends on the correct identification, interpretation of linguistic register, and the next question is unavoidable. So, how are maritime professionals prepared to operate within this communication complexity? So to bring us to the final substantive part of the lecture, education and maritime English is not as a subject, but as an instrument of safety, resilience, and professional soft power. And since 2022, maritime education in Ukraine has operated under condition of institution disruption, displacement, and direct exposed to wartime realities. Kherson State Maritime Academy, where I work, was forcibly relocated as a result of the war. And the loss of physical infrastructure did not suspend education. It accelerated a transformation in how maritime knowledge is produced, transmitted, and evaluated. So under wartime condition, education could no longer rely on stable assumption about navigation, about risk, about communication. Operational reality changed, and educational had to change within. In this sense, maritime education became a front-line safety institution. And before 2022, maritime English training focused on standardized phrases, linguistic compliances. Under wartime condition, this approach became insufficient. Navigation officers were no longer required merely to understand message. They were required to interpret risk, prioritize information, and make decisions under pressure. As a result, maritime English training shifted from language accuracy toward interpretive and decision-making competence. And cadets and officers now work with authentic navigation warnings, institutional advisors, and the table on the left illustrates this shift from compliance to the judgment, from simulating scenarios to authentic wartime advisors. What is important is that the transformation does not remain local. Language is no longer treated as a linguistical skill set. It is understood as an operational safety competence. In wartime navigation, linguistic competence and safety competence are inseparable. This pedagogical transformation has implication beyond national educational system. And in this context, maritime English functions as a form of professional soft power. It enables interoperability within multinational crews. It sustains trust between maritime institutions and operators, and it supports alignment with international safety and governance frameworks, even under condition of political uncertainty. So the flow on the right shows how wartime navigation experience is converted into global maritime safety knowledge through analysis, curriculum redesign, and international cooperation. And this is where education becomes a form of professional soft power. So education transforms wartime experience into resilience. In wartime maritime navigation, safety is not sustained by systematic alone. It is sustained by people, by how they are trained to interpret, prioritize, and how upon language under pressure. Let me conclude by briefly drawing together the main insight of this lecture. And this lecture has examined maritime safety in wartime, not a purely technical, legal, or military issue, but as a multidimensional system in which navigation, law, language, and education are deeply interconnected. The experience of the Black Sea since 2022 shows that war does not bring civilian navigation to a halt. It fundamentally transforms the condition under which navigation takes place. Maritime security shift from a stable civilian framework to a continuous high-risk regime. Here the risk is no episodic, it is constant. International maritime law and institutions remain formally intact, but their effectiveness increasingly depends on how safety-related information is communicated and interpreted at the operational level. Under these conditions, language emerges as a central safety factor, and in warning navigation, English is not merely medium of communication, it functions as an operational instrument through which uncertainty, responsibility, and decision-making are managed. And at the same time, human factor defines the limit of maritime safety. Under stress, under information overload, but communication itself can become a source of risk. And finally, education plays a strategic role. Maritime English, understood as interpretive and decision-making competence, functions as professional soft power that sustain safety and cooperation under condition of uncertainty. So in wartime maritime navigation, safety is not sustained by system alone. It is sustained by people, by how they interpret, prioritize, and act upon language under pressure. So thank you for your attention.